Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing good today. We are going to finish up chapter 2 of the PowerPoints here, and we've got a couple things to do. I'm going to kind of go through the end of this kind of fast because of the geochemical cycles, but anyhow, I'll just talk to you when I get to those slides. Uh, but this system, remember we talked about in this chapter, we talked about the laws of thermodynamics, very important to the basic concept of understanding the environment and our role in it. Because our role in it says that we cannot create or destroy matter. Lead is lead, it will always be here. The key is not to disturb it per se, so it gets into the air and we sniff it up and get it in our bodies, or put it in the pipes. Well, technically, when we put that into the pipes of flint, it was made to protect the pipes, and it actually worked for like 80 years. All right, but then we put this water through those pipes that corroded that coating that protected the lead from leaching out, and that's what made those kids sick. So it wasn't really, that pipe design was actually pretty darn smart, but the water we put through it corroded that protective covering, and then the lead started to sweep it out. So the key is, the bottom line is we cannot create or destroy matter. So that lead's always going to be with us. We got to be careful as humans not to ingest it. And then the second part is the second law of thermodynamics is every time we use energy, we've got a little bit less to use, right? Let's think of a fire. We've got all that wood sitting there on the fire. We light light it on fire, and that wood's gone. We have a little bit less energy to use after that. Okay, it goes into what's called entropy. And there's two basic rules are very important. I think we forget. Excuse me. I think we forget those rules just like we do the exponential, exponential growth function. All right, we kind of ignore that we can't destroy lead. Like I told you that story about Hillary said she wanted to get rid of all that lead. Well, we can't do that. All right. Also, we talked about how things need to have a good pH, so there can't be too much acidic levels in things. Also, we talked about fertilization and how we have those algae blooms. We'll talk about that a little bit more in this system too of Chesapeake Bay, and how everything is connected. All right, and this connection that we see in the environment is brought to you by our ecosystems. Right, so an ecosystem consists of all the organisms and the non-living entities that occur and interact in a particular area at the same time. First, you got to define the area, okay, in the time frame, and then you look around, you see how many buddies are there, how many blades of grass there are, how many trees, how many humans, how much concrete and rocks and minerals, rainfall, all that rigmarole makes up the ecosystem. All the living and non-living things in a certain defined area, and that could be Moon Township, the Robert Morris campus, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or the whole world. Right? So an ecosystem's energy flows in matter cycles between the living and the non-living compartments. Okay. So the Chesapeake Bay estuary is an ecosystem where the rivers flow into the ocean, mixing all the salt and fresh water together. Organisms are affected by the flow of water, nutrients, and sediment from the rivers. All right, like I said, the farmers would put too much fertilizer on their fields, and plants wouldn't uptake at all, and it would roll right down into the rivers and then out to the Chesapeake Bay. We cause this algae bloom, taking away the oxygen. Okay, or some of those chemicals would get in there and hurt the bay's oysters. Okay, which was another problem with the watershed area from the factories around there. So energy is converted into biomass. So remember, we talked about this last class, that the sun is the primary energy source for the earth. And if it wasn't for the plant's magical ability to convert that sunlight into chemical energy, we would not be able to have any energy around there. We wouldn't be living. All right. And that is why we call plants primary producers. All right. They do the primary production for us. So the conversion of solar energy into chemical bonds and sugars, the plant's taking the sunlight, doing that photosynthesis and turning that light energy into sugars so we can use it, is called primary production. The total chemical energy produced by the autotrophs is called gross primary production, and the energy that remains after respiration used to generate biomass, like the leaves and the stems and the roots, is called the net primary production. Right? Energy used by consumers to generate their own biomass is just secondary production. So primary production all comes from the plants, and anything left over that's not that we use to make some other stuff is called secondary production. The rate at which energy is converted into biomass is termed productivity. And this is one of the equations we use on that ecological footprint you guys are doing on your little homework assignments there. Right? So we want to figure out how much biomass we can grow on Earth, and that gives us our energy per year. Right? The energy of biomass that remains in an ecosystem after the autotrophs have sucked it in, after the plants have done their thing, the tomato produced that tomato, all right, is called the net primary productive. So after what the plants use from that sunlight and have left over for us to be able to use is called the net primary productivity, okay? And you can see here in this area, algae, beds, and reefs, of course, they have the most productivity. All right, algae, we just learned in that little petri dish, algae can grow lickety split, right? So algae and reefs have a lot of biomass productivity. And second are the rainforests and tropical forests. And when we talk about biomes and stuff next chapter, we'll learn why, because everybody wants to live in the tropical rainforest. I mean, it's nice and warm, you get plenty of water, plenty of sunlight, no huge swings in temperature, and a lot of life lives there. A lot of plants live there. And they are able to do the primary production a lot easier. And then you also see that in the open ocean where there's no, way for them to get fertilized. I mean, there's no real nutrients getting to the middle of the ocean. You're not going to see a lot of algae out there, right? Similar with the tundra, right? In the desert, you're not going to see too many plants there because plants just don't like to live there. And that's called a biome, and we'll talk about that next chapter. Ecosystems vary in the productivity. Okay, freshwater wetlands and tropical forests and quarries all have difference. All right, but there's some of that are the highest primary productors, like the core algae and tropical forests, and you have the low end, desert and tundra at the low end. So ecosystems occur at different scales. For example, adjacent ecosystems may interact and share resources extensively. All right, areas where ecosystems meet is called a transitional zone, or called an ecotones. So, you might have a little forest all around, and in the middle of that forest, you got a nice little pond, right? So most of the time, the animals all have to go to the pond to drink, right? And that's where the animals interact, but that's a different ecosystem than inside that forest. And each one of those things have a different place to live. The monkeys will live up in the trees, and the koalas or whatever. I don't know. I gotta think of something running on the ground. The lions or whatever will be on the ground, right? They all have their different areas where they live inside that forest, but then they all interact in this ecotones, in this area where they all get together and have their waters, okay? In landscape ecology, scientists view systems on a larger geographical scale to include multiple systems. So a landscape is made up of spatial arrays or patches, which may be specific ecosystems in areas of habitat of an organization. So patches are spread out spatially in the landscape of a mosaic. So here you see a basic, right here, there's going to be some other animals that are living on top of the mountain area, in the pine tree area. There's going to be some low other animals living down here in the lower forest, okay? This is where they all come to get some water, all right? We have some grasslands out here, all right? And you can see where these two are interacting, these little lines, all right? These are all the ecotones, where the animals actually kind of interact and mix together, all right? But each one of these is basically a separate ecosystem, all right? Designated by their areas. Right? We could take this all into one and make this one big ecosystem. And this is a separate one. This is a separate one. This is a separate one. Right? And when they start mixing together, that's where we get those ecotones. Conservation biologists, on the other hand, study the loss, protection, and restoration of biodiversity in the landscape. So the landscapers just look at it and try to see what's there, but the conservationist is the one that tries to, hey, what has humanity done? Our effect on it is something we can do to fix it. Do we need to fix it? All right. Landscape level analysts are aided by satellite imaging, computer stuff called Geographic Information System, GIS. I'm not too sure if Robert Morris has a GIS program here. It might be in one of their applications. It's very, very, very popular. I mean, if you ever seen a map on Google with these things that pop up, that is GIS. I know the WVU, you can get like a master's in Geographic Information Systems. It's pretty neat. I used to go to one of my buddies help me out with one of my projects I was doing. He ran the GIS while I gave the inputs. But GIS includes data on everything. Geology, the hydrology, the vegetation, the animal species, the human development, all these different things. And we've actually put this into motion. We used it for just Chesapeake Bay to monitor the restoration project. So thank goodness, it's so dynamic. That watershed in Chesapeake Bay is so dynamic and has all these different things running into it. Thank goodness we have a computer system to help see where the farmers are and the industry is, and we can put little sensors around the little areas and monitor, see if we're getting a spike here or there or whatever, and notice what's going on in the area so we can address the problem or congratulate it for doing something good. We also have what's called the biosphere. That contains many complex systems which are studied as models. So a model is simply a representation of a complex natural process. And ecological modeling involves constructing and testing models to explain and predict the systems. So, models aren't really, that complicated. It's just that looking at all these different data points that we collect and putting them together and analyzing them, all right? So ecological models are based on hypotheses that formed from data and observations. And a model makes predictions which are tested against new data and then leads to refinements. So what we have to do is we have to observe a relationship in nature. And we design a little hypothesis to explain that relationship. Okay? We construct the model, predict the relationships in nature, gather the new data, and refine the model if it needs to be refined to go all the way back to the beginning. Okay? So all the ecological models are doing is just, observing relationships among a lot of different variables in nature, and then constructing something to help explain those. And we'll talk about the global warming models and stuff when we get into climate change, and that's like a perfect example. But you can figure out if we had a forest fire, we can go back and say, okay, this fire just happened, so let's watch what happens when it grows back, and we check all that data. And then the next time the forest fire happens, we can predict how long it will take for those pine trees to go back and all this other stuff to happen. All right. And then the next fire happens, we go back, we watch it as it forms, and maybe we redo the model a little bit, maybe we tweak it. All right. But as it goes back, we watch it, okay? And then it burns down again. We say, okay, here's another chance. Let's go look at that model again and see what happens when it goes back. I bet you the trees are going to grow back this fast this time. Or then, maybe we forgot some of the weeds that grew back or something like that, okay? So models are always being adjusted and looked at. And we'll talk a little bit more about some good climate models when we get to climate change, all right? Because that's a perfect example of continuing the scientific process, all right, which demands that we keep on learning and checking our data. Human society depends on the services provided by ecological processes, right? So, we talked about ecological services in the first chapter. And some of these ecological services are just the formation of soil, water purification, pollination, breaking down of biodegradable waste, and stability, and then these negative feedback loops. So we need to have nature here. And one of the things I do as an ecological economist is try to put a price or, a value to soil, a value to that water purification, a value to that pollination of the bees. As much as I, think it's hard to really put a monetary number on the life of a bee or the work of a bee, I guess. We need to have something. And I don't know what better than price, because price really controls just about everything in this world we do. So money's it. Okay, now we can discuss whether or not that value is fair or not. And that's what we're doing today in the society, whether or not that value is fair, and say that soil formation is worth $1 billion. Okay, and we'll talk about some of those numbers later on in the class. The most important may be the cycling of the elements we call macronutrients and micronutrients. And this is definitely one of the most important things, all right, is the cycling of these elements. And we do this through what's called the biogeochemical cycles. And now remember, environmental science is the study of the environment and humanity's effect on it. All right? And we have successfully messed up many of our biogeochemical cycles. All right? So nutrients move through the system in nutrient cycles known as biogeochemical cycles. Elements for molecules travel from the atmosphere to the hydrosphere to the lithosphere to the biosphere into a dynamic equilibrium. And it's always going around. Remember, we cannot create or destroy matter. So carbon is constantly being released from the soils up into the atmosphere, hooking up with the oxygen molecules and creating CO2, and then getting sucked up by a tree and being put in that trunk and then falling down and getting eaten up by the bugs and getting released again. That carbon's getting released again back out into the atmosphere, hooking up with a couple of oxygen molecules, making CO2. They're getting sucked up this time by a dandelion, right? Getting stuck in their roots, all right? And then it stays down there in the ground. And then sooner or later, you come around for a shovel, pop it up, and pop goes that carbon molecule back up into the atmosphere and hooks together with a couple of oxygen molecules. And the next thing you know, another plant sucks that in, and we got another carbon cycle starts all over again. And this happens in a lot of different things, all right? Just in ourselves, you and a cow eat grass, sediment rocks, and in the atmosphere are all reservoirs for carbon. I mean, carbon is in everything. When you die, you're going to release carbon. Okay? That's just the way it is. And you have been sequestering carbon in your bones, too. We are all carbon life forms. Right? And that carbon is always being used again repeatedly. Because we cannot destroy or create the carbon. We just go through the carbon cycle. Right? And what we're doing as humanity is actually hurting that carbon cycle, which we'll talk about in just a couple more slides. So when a reserve releases more material than it accepts, it is called a source. Okay, so it's adding something to the cycle. When a reservoir accepts more material than it's releasing, it's called a sink. Right? So we have a source and we have a sink. So a carbon source would be your car running that gasoline, releasing that carbon into the atmosphere. Carbon sink would be the algae in the ocean, which sucks up that carbon into their bodies. Or a tree would be the carbon sink. The rainforest is a carbon sink. All right? Except for this is probably the first year, unbelievable, this is the first year, if I'm not mistaken, you might have to look this up. You can do it for a current event or something. But this is the first year I think that the tropical rainforest was not a carbon sink, but a carbon source. All right, we were actually putting more carbon. The rainforest down in Brazil was putting out more carbon than it was actually sequestering. And that is not a good sign, because that's one of our biggest, if not the biggest, terrestrial land carbon sink we have. Okay, the ocean is the biggest carbon sink we have. Flux is the rate at which the materials move between the reservoirs. So you have the source, which is low flux, goes into the sink. And the sink, long residence time, and it's that small flux that we actually send it out as a source. So these sinks don't really release too fast, right? But the sources usually release real fast, okay? And the sink sucks it up, holds it there for a long, long time typically, and then eventually will release the carbon or whatever it's in. So the first cycle, geochemical cycle we're going to go through is the water cycle, which affects all of the cycles. So water is the medium of all biochemical reaction, and it plays a key role for nearly every environmental system. It carries the nutrients, returns atmospheric pollutants to the surface through rain and snow. It does a whole bunch. We're going to have a whole chapter on the water coming up here later on in the class. But this is basically called the hydrological cycle. And it summarizes how water flows as a solid through a liquid and a gas through our environment. And all it is, I think you guys all seen this, the rain, water comes down in rain, washes out into our rivers and lakes, and eventually evaporates back up into the atmosphere, gets in these clouds, and starts raining again. And like I said, environmental science is the study of the environment, humanity's role on it. And then we are actually messing up these geochemical cycles. And you might say, hey, Dr. Buck, how can we be messing up the water cycle? We're not doing it. How can we mess up rain? I mean, rain's got to come down, right? What happens? Well, let me put it this way. We all know about evaporation, right? When it gets warm, water will evaporate at a certain rate, right? That's part of the laws of thermodynamics, right? We have an equation for that. So when it's 60 degrees, we have this little bit of evaporation. The water will evaporate at a certain rate. Okay, I'm not too sure what that rate is. But we know that, right? It's kind of common sense in science, right? So what happens when it gets hotter, right? It goes from like 60 to 80. That water is going to evaporate a little bit more, right? We're going to have a little bit more water vapor releasing from that contained water, right? And if it gets to be 100, it will evaporate even faster, right? So what we have done in humanity as humans is, and we'll talk about this in more depth during the climate section, but we're warming this earth. There's no ands, ifs, or buts about it, folks, all right? The average temperature of the earth is growing hotter and hotter and hotter. And when it gets hotter and hotter and hotter, what happens? Water evaporates more and more and more, right? So we have actually increased the atmosphere, the water cycle. We have increased the vapor in the atmosphere by about 4%. That's a big increase when you think about it, all right? And just think about the news that you see lately, all right? All the floods that are happening out there, okay? All the rainstorms. I remember Nikki Haley, she was governor, I think, of South Carolina or North Carolina. North Carolina, I think, maybe. I can't remember which one. But I remember watching her on the press conference. She came out this one day and she goes, this is going to be like a 1 in a 10-year rainfall, so be prepared, folks. Came out next hour and said, hey, this is going to be a 1 in a 100-year rainfall. Be really prepared. And then she came out and said, this is going to be a 1 in a 1,000-year rainfall, everybody. Be really, really careful out there. If you got to leave. And then finally she came out like the fourth time saying, get the heck out of town. We've never seen anything like this. Because the rain was just immense. There was so much water vapor caught by that tropical storm because the oceans were so hot. Oh, man, I just kept on laughing. It was a sad day. But it was so funny seeing how she kept on increasing the water and the rain that was going to come down each time she came out. But that's basically what we're doing. Humanity is affecting this geochemical cycle by putting more water vapor in it because we are responsible for global warming. No ands, ifs, or buts about it. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit more in that climate section. Okay. So that's the water cycle. I think you guys all understand how that works. Okay. And we also have the carbon cycle, which we've been talking about a little bit now. All right, and we'll have a bigger talk about this during the climate change section. All right, but carbon is found in all organic molecules, so we are carbon-based life forms. All right, and we wouldn't be around if we weren't. And we thought everything was carbon-based for a while until we saw those sulfuric vents down there in the bottom of the ocean. We were like, how can that happen? Well, some life forms aren't carbon-based. So that's why we think maybe there's some other life somewhere on another planet on one of the billions and trillions and gazillions of planets out there, right? But the carbon cycle describes the route that carbon takes through the environment. And just like the water cycle, all right? Like I kind of talked about before, we have the plants here that will collect the carbon, all right, and eventually will die, and the ditrophytes, the biodegraders will release that carbon into the atmosphere, all right, or we'll breathe it out. Sometimes you get some carbon coming out of the volcanoes, all right. Also down in deep oceans, and there's a carbon cycle just in the water being able to release, all right. And then you see here is the fossil fuels down here. So there's a lot of these trees and stuff like that. We'll talk about a little bit more in the energy section that are stuck down here, and they're kind of sequestered, all right? They are a sink. So a long time ago, these trees didn't make it into the carbon cycle and got stuck down here underneath the earth, and that's where they stay. And that brought down all the carbon in the atmosphere, hence actually cooling the earth, right? Or building, I should say, building the atmosphere as well, okay? Because it's kind of strange how we had no carbon, and then the plants came in, and the carbon's actually decreasing. Now we're actually increasing it again, all right? So we got it down to a nice little healthy level. And humanity's been around for about 1,000 years. We've had a stable climate all that time because the carbon level, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has actually stayed kind of consistent. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail. But what we have actually done is actually increased it. Okay, we are taking these fossil fuels and releasing them into the atmosphere, increasing this geochemical cycle, putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. And CO2 is a greenhouse gas, right? So the more think of it as a little balloon. We'll put all these little tiny balloons out here into the atmosphere, which trap the latent heat from the sun and makes it a little bit warmer. And every time we add a balloon, it's going to get a little bit warmer. You too could do that experiment, all right? Run that experiment. So what's humanity doing? We're messing up the carbon cycle. What we used to be a nice little 280 to 200 parts per million in the atmosphere. Right now, I think the last current reading in Hawaii was 411 parts per million. Humanity was not around on the earth when that was around. Okay, we no human was alive. Okay, or I don't think some of the animals we have today. All right, but we used to have a whole bunch of carbon in the atmosphere. All right, but those trees over time, and those autotrophs eventually, and the algae eventually sequestered it for us to bring down the temperature, and we could actually live a little bit more comfortable. Okay. So the carbon cycle circulates all vital nutrients. Okay, the producers pull in the carbon dioxide out of the air and then give us the sugars. All right. So it's also very vital. If we didn't have that carbon cycle for them to eat on, to chum on, we would not have all those sugars that they produce. And this also happens in the water systems. Okay. So the nitrogen cycle. Geez, I'm sorry about that. Not formatted too good. There's also what's called the nitrogen cycle, which involves a specialized bacteria, okay? And they release nitrogen into the atmosphere. The same kind of way we do it, all right? The nitrogen will just do another little circular flow. It will go up into the atmosphere and eventually work its way down into the soils, get taken up by the plants again, all right? Some will get stuck down into some fossil fuels down here, some will get into the ocean, all right, and then some will get eventually released. It's a natural cycle of nitrogen, all right? But what's happening here is that we are using these plants. We take up this fossil fuels, all right, and your propane used to be what's called methane. But we take out the nitrogen out of that methane, and we make this propane, all right? So we get a bigger bang for our buck. It burns a lot hotter, a lot cleaner for us, all right? And then we have all this nitrogen left over. So what are we doing? We are selling that nitrogen to the farmer out here, all right? And the farmer gets to go and spread it all over his fields dirt cheap, and then all of a sudden we have the runoff into the oceans, and we have those algae blooms, all right? And that is causing a lot of economic troubles, right? And like I said, we try to do some best management practices so we stop this runoff. All right. But we're working on it. We're not there exactly yet. We also have to do some remodeling of the watershed and stuff like that to really make a big impact. But we're trying, we recognize it. But humanity's role in this nitrogen cycle is that we're adding a lot more to the land. We're taking it from the fossil fuels that was once sequestered, all right? It was once a sink for this nitrogen, releasing it on the land again, and then overflowing the cycle, causing those algae blooms. So we're messing this whole natural cycle has been influenced by humanity. Okay? All over the world. You saw those little dots on that map. Okay? So to become biological available, nitrogen fixation will combine with nitrogen, hydrogen, and ammonia in all the plants. So the plants have this magical ability to uptake this stuff. Right? We're not going to get into the chemistry behind that. Just remember that they're able to take that nitrogen right out of the air and put it right back down. Right? So not only do they have the power to do that without the carbon dioxide and put it in the trunks, they also have that to do with the nitrogen. Now, some plants are better than others. Right? But the only way to really fix this is stop putting so much nitrogen on the atmosphere. I don't think we have enough plants that can really uptake what we put down because we're already overflowing. That's the problem is we're already adding too much nitrogen to the plants that don't overeat. Remember I said I think the plants are smart? Okay, and that's my opinion. You don't have to believe me. Okay, you can say plants don't have a brain, Dr. Buckner. That's okay. But they don't overeat. All right? They fix just enough nitrogen that they need to fix. Right? And we're the ones that are overflowing. Okay? The intense energy of lightning strikes can also fix nitrogen. Okay? We also have some nitrogen fixing bacteria out there. All right. And like I said, the plants like legumes and soybeans are really, really good at fixing that nitrogen. You'll see a lot of farmers do what's called cover crops. So during the winter time, they'll put some winter soybeans or legumes in there, and that will fixate the nitrogen into the ground. Okay. So, and finally, we have the phosphorus cycle, which circulates limited nutrients. All right, and phosphorus is one of the hardest nutrients to get because that really just comes from the weatherization. Just go to the little map here. That really comes from the weatherization. All right, there's no rain or anything like that happens. It's basically in these rocks, and the wind and the water will weather down the rocks, taking that phosphorus and putting it into our rivers, and we get that runoff. Okay, but that's not good enough for us because we have, 7.6 billion people on this earth to feed. So we actually do a lot of phosphorus mining, right, and getting that phosphorus out. We actually don't wait for Mother Nature to weather down the rocks like natural phosphorus cycle works, right? We actually mine it out. And we're overusing, just like we're overusing the nitrogen, we're overusing the phosphorus because that's another plant and another thing that the plants actually definitely need, but we overfeed them. And they are smart and don't overeat, and a lot of that stuff gets sent down the rivers through runoff, right, causing another algae bloom, right? So we're also messing up the old natural phosphorus cycle, right? So tackling nutrient enrich requires diverse approach. All right. So the phosphorus and the fertilizer all have a lot of problems with Chesapeake Bay. All right. A lot of watersheds are actually affected by this nutrient pollution that from the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle overuse. Right. And what we try to do is, we have to reduce the farm and lawn fertilizer application. This is number one right here. And that's why we try to, WVU, when I was going to school there, we would work with farmers and help them put in what's called best management practices. Figure out how much those plants need to eat or want to eat or can eat, and only putting down what we need to put down, not overdoing it. Okay. And, farmers were happy. They got better yields, or the same kind of yields, I guess. Actually a little bit better, and they actually save money because they won't waste the money on fertilizer that was just running down the river and into the watershed, causing a dead zone there in the Gulf of Mexico. Okay? Planting vegetation and buffer zones, also in wetlands all around the stream for nutrient trap. You see these little ripen areas all around the streams. Okay, we need to protect these little tiny areas, and we'll see this when we watch this little video about Yellowstone National Park. I think I'm going to play that next slideshow. All right, but these little ripen areas, these little buffer zones, are very important from stopping that runoff getting in here, because the trees will actually stop that nitrogen and phosphorus from going in there. All right, we also need to improve our sewage treatment technology, because nitrogen and phosphorus comes from us, from our waste, but also animal waste too, all that agricultural waste as well. And reducing our fossil fuel consumption. Because a lot of times, we take out that nitrogen and that phosphorus out of the fossil fuels because it's all mixed up in there, and then we go sell it on the open market, right? But if we reduce that, we wouldn't have that product, and we were just overabundant in that stuff anyways. So tackling nutrient requirements, diverse approaches. The cost of each treatment varies, and natural approaches like wetlands and vegetation buffers are the most economical. So, here's the storm runoff retrofits where we had to actually put some humanity into this and make some storm management for new development, put in some pipes and overflows and all that other stuff, right? And here's some other human stuff, the WWTP, high grades, wastewater treatment plant. Okay, that's what that stands for. Upgrades to fix our human population. The cities are getting more and more people in them, and more people means more and more poop. All right, so it's very, very expensive. But what we have found is using Mother Nature, which I call, I didn't term this term, call an ecological machine. Right. So instead of trying to do a wastewater treatment plant and putting in all these storm waters, we still need them, okay? When it comes down to the rivers, we make sure that our native oyster aquaculture is working right, all right? Because that's the oyster's job, is to do that, is to get that stuff out of there before it causes that algae bloom, all right? So we make sure the native oysters are. On a farmland, we use cover crops to sequester that nitrogen for next year instead of having to put new nitrogen down year after year after year. We use grass buffers to stop the runoff from the farms, right? Forest busters. Restore constructed wetlands. All right, this is one of my favorite ones. I mean, we restored constructed wetlands all over Chesapeake Bay area, and it has been a huge success. There's a professor, one of my favorite professors, because his name is John Todd, Professor John Todd. He was the one that created or termed the term ecological machine. He began with living machine, but then someone ripped that name off and trademarked it, so he can't use it. So now we call it the ecological machine. But he's the one that really talked about how we restore these wetlands by using just Mother Nature. All right, and I think this is the best way to do it, because Mother Nature knows what they're doing. Right, and you can see how some of this stuff can be very, very expensive. All right, so it's all up to us how we're going to really fix some of these things. And of course, we will talk about how we're going to fix some of these things, such as the carbon cycle and the water problem, when we get to those chapters. All right, so that's it for chapter 2, carbon cycle. I hope you guys appreciated it. And next week we will be talking about systems, feedback loops, and stuff. All right. So tune in, and if you guys have any questions, let me know. Don't forget your current event is due on Friday, and then we'll start, and then your chapter review is due Sunday, and then we'll start doing that back and forth that Wednesday and Sunday, Wednesday and Sunday, Wednesday and Sunday. Okay? If you have any questions, give me an email. All right? See you.